Before getting started with setting up our development environment, I'm going to speak a little bit about developing mobile apps in general and how Appzio architecture differs from many of the tools that you might already know. Traditional setup for mobile development is that you have your mobile developers, iOS and for Android. Then there's a backend developer. And since you have a team of people, you're probably going to need someone to manage the team. And if it's an application that relies on server side, you also need someone in charge of deploying the application, setting up the hosting environment, and making sure that the backend scales. So you need a bunch of people to realize a mobile application, and because of that, mobile development tends to be a little bit on the slow side and also a little bit on the expensive side. How Appzio changes this setup is that Appzio applications can be built by a single PHP developer. Of course, you can share the work with a team of PHP developers, but even for a fairly large application, a single PHP developer can handle the entire project from beginning to an end. And this gives us an enormous speed advantage. If we look at how traditionally most mobile frameworks work, whether they use JavaScript or some other language, the setup is normally so that you have a client talking to some sort of a service or server, and they communicate using a RESTful API in most cases. And through that API, we exchange JSON. So the server gives some data to the client, and the client includes some logic to render it and work with the data. I'm using here as an example a native script, a fairly popular framework where you develop in JavaScript. At least the promise is that you develop once and you can deploy for both iOS and Android. With very few frameworks, in the end, it really works that way. There are normally some considerations that you need to take for both platforms. But at large, the promise there holds. In case of native script takes JavaScript and translates it into a language that iOS and Android understand natively. There's of course some overhead there on the translation, but like in the case of native script, it's not huge. Then you have the application code. Part of your application logic might be on the client, part of it might be on the server. And your application needs to have some kind of an API to talk to the server. On the server side, we have an API. That's the counterpart for the client. And then we have the application code. We might have business logic. We might have just more simple control routines. And depending on what your backend is, it might be using some existing framework, existing modules. There's probably a way for accessing data and integrating with third parties. This is the normal setup, almost regardless of which framework you choose for the mobile development. With Appzio, this is somewhat simplified, as it is truly server-side development. You build everything on the server side using PHP, and we send it to the client, and the client interprets it as instructions. So the JSON that we send is read by the client, and using native components, all the views and all the functionality is implemented. You don't need to work on the client. Everything is built on the server, which gives us also a benefit that whenever we deploy changes, we don't actually need to update the client. The client will pick up the changes automatically. And this is the primary reason why developing apps on top of Appzio is so much faster than the traditional way. When we open an Appzio client, it first calls home, it calls to the server, using a method called create user. This create user returns a configuration, and based on this configuration, the client knows what to download, how to look, how to behave. So when it gets the configuration, it knows to download the right resources in the right order so that the client is, the end user is not affected by these downloads. So the resources can be downloaded from the server, or it can be downloaded from the CDN. Good enough for the first primer. Let's look at some applications in action. The first application I'm going to present is a mobile feedback application called GIFIT. We will set it up on the local environment here. So we will be running all the demos in a simulator. It's exactly the same as it would work on the device. It's just easier for the presentation purposes.